Chapter 32, Section 1. So by the 1700s, people in the West, Western Europe, have new ideas about government. Um, the people decide they want a voice in politics. They want equal justice under the law. They don't think it's right that just because you're rich or well known, you should have different rules. The people don't think that a church or monarchy had the right to tell them what to do. And you're going to see thinkers and writers start spreading these ideas about freedom, about ideas about the right to change the government. And so the 1700s is going to become known as the Age of Enlightenment. This was a time of increased knowledge. And let's start off by talking about the revolution that's going to occur in England. So there's going to be a struggle in England between the king and Parliament. Okay? And there ends up being a civil war, which evolves into a revolution, this attempt to overthrow or change the government. In the end, Parliament wins. And so now the English monarch will rule in the name of the people. So we had talked last, I think, about the English monarchy. We talked about Elizabeth I being queen. Well, in 1603, Queen Elizabeth dies. She's the last Tudor monarch. She never married, though. And so the crown, this royal power, is going to go to a relative since she has no children. And it ends up going to James VI of Scotland. He was a member of the Stuart family. Okay, so remember, Elizabeth I was the last Tudor monarch. He's a member of the Stuart family. And so he had been King of Scotland, and so he now becomes James I of England. James is going to rule different. So the Tudor rulers, they were very powerful, but careful to get Parliament's opinion on action. So they had a lot of power, but they would always kind of check with Parliament. James I, on the other hand, he believed in rule by divine right. This belief that the right to rule comes from God. Now, Parliament is going to object to some of the stuff he does. And James just dismisses Parliament for about 10 years. Tells Parliament they're dismissed. They can go home. Not needed. You're also going to have some religious differences between Parliament and the king. James I, he wanted everybody to be Anglican. But many of the people in Parliament weren't Anglican, they were Puritans. Puritans, they wanted a variety of things. Puritans wanted to worship their own way. Okay? They believed in hard work. They didn't like how the crown, James, is spending the money. And the Puritans wanted a say in how the government raised and spent their tax money. James I even goes so far, he wants a new translation of the Bible. And he's going to appoint a committee of church officials. And they are going to basically translate the Bible into what becomes known as the King James version of the Bible. There are many churches today that still use the King James version of the Bible, okay, from all the way back in 1611. In 1625, James I dies. His son will become king. So his son will become Charles I. Charles I held pretty much the same beliefs about the monarchy as James, as his father, the whole idea of divine right and all of that. In 1628, Charles is going to ask Parliament to approve some new taxes. You see, he had to pay for some wars. England was at war with Spain, they were at war with France, and they need more money. Parliament sees this as their chance to kind of limit the crown's power, because Parliament wants more power for itself. And so Parliament draws up the Petition of Rights, which is going to say things like this: the king cannot declare martial law. Martial law is when the army rules, okay, rather than Parliament or whatever. So the king can't declare martial law. Says that the crown needs Parliament approval if they're going to pass taxes. And the king cannot put people in prison just because he doesn't like them or they're a thorn in his side. He wants them out of their way. Charles I agrees to this. He needs Parliament support on these new taxes, and he agrees. But then the following year, 1629, Charles I changes his mind and dismisses Parliament. But then in 1640, Charles I needs money again. He needs to build a larger army because the English were fighting the Scottish. The Scots were Presbyterian. Charles was trying to force them to follow the Anglican Church. The Scots revolt and basically take over the northern part of England. And so Charles has to call Parliament back together again. And Parliament basically says, all right, if you need our help, here's the deal. We got ideas here. They want to limit his power. So they're going to pass laws getting rid of any taxes that were passed without Parliament approval. They passed a law saying that Parliament had to regularly meet. And they did away with something called the Star Chamber, which was basically the king's royal court to put people on trial with no jury. In 1642, there ends up being another civil war. The Parliament versus the Crown. Charles had accepted the laws and then turned around and just broke them again. And so the two sides in this are going to be, on one hand, you've got the Cavaliers. These were people that supported the crown, the king or queen. And many of them had this curly, shoulder-length hair. It's mostly going to be rich Roman Catholics and Anglicans. On the other hand, you had Roundheads. These were the people who they supported Parliament. They wore their hair short, mostly middle and lower class, Puritans and other Calvinists. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan leader who backed Parliament. And he's going to form the New Model Army. And this army, they worked hard. They had strict rules that you follow. No drinking, no swearing, no robbing. And they chose their officers because they were good leaders and good fighters, not just because they were born into the right family. And in 1646, the new model army is going to beat the king's army. The war is over. Many leaders, though, they still liked the idea of a monarchy, but they didn't trust Charles I. He had agreed all the time, and then he turned around and broke his promise. So Cromwell and his supporters are going to put Charles I on trial for treason, and in 1649, Charles I will be beheaded.